He was there, the Bible tells us, the end of that chapter, for 3 years. So from the time of Tamar's death till the time that Absalom hatched the plan to take the life of Amnon was 2 years. After that, he fled to Geshur. He lived there for 3 years. So for 5 years, this dark cloud has been hanging over the house of David and over all of Israel. 2 Samuel 14, Joab, the king's right-hand man, also the nephew of the king, that's the designation, the son of Zeruiah, he understands that things aren't well. The first verse there in chapter 14 says, Joab knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. Now, when we read it, especially at the end, coming off the end of chapter 13, where it tells us that the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom, and then verse 14, the king's heart went out to Absalom, we may be inclined to think that there's this desire on David's part for compassion towards Absalom, that his heart's going out over what he has done and the hurt that he has felt because of what happened to his sister. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I say that because I don't know that the translation here that's given of the Hebrew is exactly conveyed the way it should be in our English version. You may, in fact, if you're reading from the ESV tonight, if you look at the end of chapter 13 at verse 39, it tells us there's a little superscript 3 next to the T in the word out at the end of that chapter, in the middle of that verse. The king longed to go out. It's a marginal note, and when you look at that at the bottom of your text there, it says it's also rendered or can be compared to this rendering, it ceased to go out. Meaning his heart ceased to go out to Absalom. Meaning it wasn't a heart filled with compassion for him, but it was a heart that was hardening toward him. His heart was no longer set on his son over this treacherous thing that he had done in taking the life of his brother. And I think that makes a little bit more sense when we come to chapter 14. Joab, the king's right-hand man, has seen this rock on for 5 years, that there's friction in the house of David between David and Absalom. Joab understands in his position the danger that this could probably pose to David as well as the kingdom itself. And he's trying to figure out, we need to get this resolved. The king's heart is not going out to Absalom. And I think that's a more accurate rendering, because if the king's heart was going out to Absalom, the whole story that unfolds here, put into place by Joab, really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why does he have to seek out a woman from a city that's 10 miles away from Jerusalem to put on the ruse and put on the disguise, concoct this story to go and to kind of catch David in the situation that he is in? If David's heart was really longing for Absalom and reconciliation to take place, surely Joab would have just said, man, let's go get this done. Let's make this happen. So I think the picture is that there's a whole lot of friction, a whole lot of mess going on in the house of David, especially between David and Absalom. Again, it's understandable. And so Joab, wanting to set things right, wanting to get things where they need to be perhaps, sets out in this really unbelievable way to make it happen. If we listen again to the plan of Joab, bringing a wise woman from Tekoa and putting this story in her mouth to go before King David, setting up this whole meeting with the king as well, it really is very interesting, the parallel that it has with another situation in David's life, isn't it? Do you remember when Nathan the prophet came to David after his sin with Bathsheba and said, let me tell you a story about a man who had a lamb, and that lamb was taken and slaughtered for a man who had much. And he concocts this story. He tells this parable so that David can come to an understanding and ultimately confess the sin that he has committed before God. Perhaps Joab had come to understand that's how that change came about in David's life, how he repented of that. And so maybe in his mind, he's thinking, you know what, we can employ this method again. We'll concoct this story. We'll put this parable together. Get this woman, make her look disheveled. She's been mourning for her child many days. Go to the king and speak what I tell you to. And in verse 4, the plan is hatched. She comes before the king, falls on the ground, pays homage. Save me, O king. David says, what's going on? Tell me your trouble. And she paints an incredibly sad story. She tells him in verse 5, I am a widow. My husband is dead. I had 2 sons. They quarreled with one another in the field. No one to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. It's interesting to me as we hear this playing out. It makes my mind, at least, go to Genesis chapter 4, where you had 2 brothers out in the field, Cain and Abel, right? She tells this story, and she says, now the whole clan, that is her family, they've risen up against me, your servant, and they're wanting me to hand over the man who killed my son. Of course, that's her other son, and they want to put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. And she said, if they do that, they're going to destroy the heir. They'll take away the living son who is the heir of all that his father had, and that would quench my coal. A couple of ways we can take that. Quenching her coal would possibly mean that it would take whatever provision she had. That this son would be the only means in which she could provide for herself. The coal that would be needed to heat the home, to provide resource for the family. It could mean that she's saying, to quench my coal, kind of a euphemism. That's the only warmth. That's the only light that I have left in my life. And if that's snuffed out, what am I going to do? And then she adds to that, if his life is taken, that my husband, his name will no longer remain on the face of the earth. She tells the story exactly as Joab had told her to. In verse 8, David gives his response, go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you. That's an interesting reply. It's kind of non-committal, isn't it? And maybe David's employing some wisdom here. You know, maybe he's trying to say, I need to do some more research. I need to get more details. I mean, after all, Proverbs tell us, when the first person comes with their story, they always seem right till you hear the other side of it. And so maybe he needs to get more information. Maybe he needs to get, some more details, talk to a few other people. But then immediately the woman replies to the king, on me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house let the king and his throne be guiltless. She says, whatever comes out of this, you have no responsibility. Let anything that comes wrong out of this be on me. She's pleading for judgment on her behalf. And at those words, the king, David, seems to be moved. And so he says in verse 10, if anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again. Verse 11, she says, please, king, invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son be not destroyed. And David replies, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Now, you'll see this in a moment as we get to the second half of the chapter, but there's a lot of irony in the words that David speaks right there. Not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Just hold on to that. Hold on to that. But she finally has the king's ear and also his heart, and she says, please invoke the Lord that the avenger of blood kill no more. Now that phrase, avenger of blood, takes us back to the Old Testament laws of the people of God. So God had made provision within the kingdom of his people that should blood be shed and a life be taken, the one who had taken that life, there were cities of refuge that they could flee to before the avenger of blood, the nearest kinsman or the family of the one whose life had been taken, could take their life. Again, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. He who ever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And so there were cities of refuge that they could get to that would provide safe harbor until the case could be heard, it could be judged and adjudicated, and the avenger of blood could not act. So what she's asking for here is, don't let the avenger of blood take any action. Prohibit them from doing absolutely anything. And this is where it gets kind of interesting in the story. Because what she's trying to do is, as you noted when we read it, she's trying to set David up here. She's trying to get David to a place to where she can bring up the real issue that Joab wants to discuss. This is just a story that's been concocted. And in some ways, it parallels the situation in David with his own son. But in many other ways, it's very unlike it. I would remind you that the murder that Absalom committed against Amnon would be what we consider murder in the first. It was premeditated homicide. For 2 years, he sat on it and planned it, concocted it. He put together the story of, come out and shear the sheep with me. Oh no, we're not all going to go. That'd be too much of a burden on you, Absalom. Well, okay, just let the guys come. And then Amnon, when he gets drunk, he tells his guys, gives them the signal, take him out. Cold-blooded murder. The story that this woman tells to David, not exactly like that. She says they were just out in the field and things got heated and one took the life of the other. This would fall under the judicial system in our country, what we would probably classify as manslaughter. Not premeditated, but in an act of rage and anger, certainly inappropriate and inexcusable, but it's not premeditated, and it's judged and adjudicated somewhat differently. So there's differences here. But then when she gets to this part of, please let the king invoke the Lord, that the avenger of blood will kill no more, you begin to wonder, well, is this story really manslaughter? Was there something more here? There's some holes in what she's saying. But nevertheless, David says, yes, as the Lord lives, no one's going to harm your son. The king has given his word. And then verse 12, she gets to the heart of what Joab really wants her to say. Let me speak one more word. The king says, speak. And she says, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? Now, this is interesting. And remember, Joab's behind all of this. Do you remember back in chapter 13? Do you remember both with Amnon and with Absalom? There was this other shady figure, Jonadab, who was a very crafty man. And he's employing some shadiness so that Amnon can get what he wants out of Tamar, and probably working along with Absalom for these 2 years to hatch the plan that will ultimately lead to Amnon's death while they're shearing the sheep. So got all this craftiness going on. And it's interesting here that she says, you have planned such a thing against the people of God. Again, these are the words of Joab given to her. In the story that she told David about her 2 sons, she made mention, my clan is out to get me. The family, they want the life of this other son, because if they take his life, both sons are dead, the husband is no more, there's no seed that can be brought up or raised up, and all that is theirs, once the wife, the mother remaining dies, will be distributed among any surviving next of kin. She's like, the family, it's about the family's out to do this. And now, in a twist of words, as she's really getting to what Joab wants her to deal with in light of David, she broadens the family perspective. She says, I don't want to talk to you really about my family. I want to talk to you about God's family. I want to talk to you about the people of God. She says, how can you then plan such a thing against us, the people of God? She goes on, she says, for in giving this decision, you have convicted yourself. Inasmuch, and here's how, the king does not bring his banished one home again. She said, don't you see? You've allowed for my son to be brought back home, but yet you've not done anything to bring your son home. How can you make this ruling in the story that I've just shared with you, but yet not put into action the very thing in your life. Now, this is interesting. I forget which commentator it was, but they pointed out very aptly and importantly that there's a big distinction in how she's approaching David and driving this point home and making the connection to the story that she just shared versus how Nathan did it previously in 2 Samuel. You remember Nathan tells the story? Man had a lamb. Rich guy came and took the lamb, slaughtered it. You remember what David says? Man, we're going to deal with that. And then Nathan says, you are the man. This is what you've done exactly with the murder of Uriah and taking his wife Bathsheba. But the difference in those two is the direction in which they worked. In the story given by Nathan the prophet, Nathan is dealing first with David's feelings that will then lead him to conviction. In this story, with the wise woman from Tekoa, she's seeking to overthrow David's convictions and simply deal with his feelings. There's a reversal that's there. You're going to see that in just a moment, but keep that in mind. Why are you doing this? Why would you not let this one who has been banished come back home again? And then she says, verse 14, we must all die. We are all like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. So here's what she's saying. Amnon's life is gone. What's happened with Tamar has happened with Tamar. It's like water spilled on the ground. It can't be brought back. It can't be undone. Why not just move on and let's just bring Absalom back and everything will be good again. And then she goes on and says, but God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. Now, on the surface, that sounds really, really good. In essence, what she's saying is, you know what? God is a giver of life. He's a restorer. He's devising means so that no one who is banished will have to remain an outcast. David, this is who God is. And we hear that on the surface and we think, man, that's absolutely the case. I mean, God is a God who brings the wayward back home. I mean, think about the story of the prodigal son, right? But not so fast. We got to keep going a little bit further, but not so fast. She says, I've come to say this, my Lord. So I'm speaking to the king, that the king will perform this request. Here, deliver the servant from the hand of the man who destroyed me and my son together from the heritage of God. That the king will set me at rest. Rest. Isn't that what the Lord was promising David? Rest. And now his house is anything but restful. And then on top of all of this, she employs some flattery. You know, you're like the angel of God. You can discern good from evil. Man, David, you can figure this out. You see the connection. You hear what I'm saying. And David, exercising some discernment, says, who puts you up to this? It's got to be Joab, right? I mean, surely Joab had said something to him previously, and now he's connecting all the dots. Or maybe Joab was kind of peeking around the corner, looking into the king's room. How's it going? Yeah. And David's seen him in the background, and the light bulb's going off. This was Joab, wasn't it? She confesses, yes, this was Joab. Joab wants this to come to a resolution. Joab wants this thing to be resolved. And then at the end of verse 20, again, she pours on the flattery. But my Lord has wisdom, like the wisdom of the angel of God, to know all things that are on the earth. And Joab's then called before the king. And David says, okay, go and bring back Absalom. And Joab, delighted to hear this news, thinking, hey, it's all going to be fixed. Everything's going to be back right. Things will press on and be well. Bless the king. I found favor in your sight. You've granted this request of your servant. And Joab gets up to go out. But before he can get to Absalom and bring him back, David says in verse 24, but he's not going to be in my house. And he's not going to look on my face. He can come to Jerusalem, but I don't want to see him. And so, in a sense, only half of what Joab was hoping for was going to come about. Yes, Absalom would be brought back to Jerusalem, but there would be no reconciliation. There would be no repair in the fractured relationship between David and Absalom. The author tells us, the text tells us, verse 24, so Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. All right, now let's go to the second half of the chapter. Now, in all Israel, there was no one much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it, when it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. And there were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. Now, these may be the most interesting verses in all the chapter because really you could pull these verses out and the story would flow just as smooth, if not smoother. We end with David granting Joab the request to go and to bring back Absalom, employing the parameter that he's got to live apart from David and doesn't come into his presence. If we jump from the end of verse 24 to verse 28, it flows rather smoothly, doesn't it? So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. Smooth as it could be, right? So why in the world do we have these 3 verses here that tell us that Absalom was just an absolutely studly man and had a head of hair that would make men and women in this room tonight absolutely envious? Well, do you remember where the story of David began? The king who preceded him, Saul, and why he was chosen? Because of his appearance. Because he was head and shoulders above everybody else. Because he looked good to all the people. Do you remember why David was chosen? Not because he was the best looking of the sons of Jesse. No, he was the run of the litter. And it's the King James Bible that tells us he had a ruddy complexion. He was sunburned from being out in the field watching the sheep all the time. He was the last choice. But here we're given this kind of interlude into this description of Absalom. Man, the guy never had a pimple. No zit cream in his toiletry bag. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, no blemish in him. The people looked at him on the outside and were just in awe. And on the inside, Absalom looked at himself and he was in awe as well. Look at me. Look at who I am. Where we're told about his hair, right? I told you to mark what David said. Not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Well, the hair of his son Absalom is going to play a pretty big part in his story. Not only here in letting us know what type of guy he is, but ultimately in his demise that's to come. But here we're told that he had these locks of hair that were thick and full and cut at one time a year, and it grew heavy on him. And when he cut it that one time a year, he weighed the hair of his head. Who in the world weighs the hair of their head? How vain of a person do you have to be to weigh the hair of your head? Hey, y'all sweep that up. I need to get a measurement on that. That's a lot of hair I grew this year. Good looking hair. He wasn't sending it to the wig makers. He just wanted to know, man, look what I did. And apparently it was a large amount of hair, 200 shekels by the king's weight. We don't exactly know what the king's weight is, but 200 shekels of it seemed to be impressive. A lot of hair. A lot of hair. So we had this interlude, this awkward description of Absalom so that we get this outward description of him so that we know what he's really like on the inside. He's a man that's full of himself and filled with pride. And I think we're told that because it helps in some ways to paint the picture of what's going on here between David and Absalom. That there is this rift between them, in part because David has failed to act in carrying out the justice that the king should in defending the honor of Tamar, likewise in defending or at least adjudicating what took place between Absalom and Amnon at the end of 2 Samuel 13. And then on the other side, you've got Absalom, this young, pride-filled, envious, treacherous, angry, frustrated young man. Verse 28 says, "So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but Joab would not come to him. And he sent a second time, but Joab would not come to him." So maybe Joab's gotten the picture of Absalom. Maybe Joab's finally realized, you know what? This isn't going the way that I hoped that it would. I'm not getting what I ultimately wanted, some reconciliation to happen. Verse 30, then he, that is Absalom, said to his servants, "See, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." He wants to get his attention. Now, this is somewhat interesting, and again, there's another echo, allusion, parallel to a story that we have in the book of Judges of Samson, right? Setting the fields of the Philistines on fire. And if you know anything about Samson, you know the kind of man that he was, very brash and just unhinged in a lot of ways. Also had some pretty impressive hair as well, did he not? So there's all of these kind of interwoven connections here. But he says, go and burn his barley, and that'll send him coming. So he does. Verse 31, then Joab arose. I read that with the understanding of great haste. Joab, the fields are on fire. You better go see Absalom. And he went to Absalom in his house and said, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" And Absalom answered Joab, "Behold, I sent word to you, come here, that I may send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still." You hear his frustration? Why did you bring me back here? I can't come into the king's palace. I can't be in your presence. This cloud is still hanging over me. I don't know if I'm going to be judged, if justice is going to be meted out. I don't know if there's reconciliation. I have no idea what's going on. No idea. He says, "Now therefore let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death." Verse 33, then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. It's not as rosy as you may think. There's no mention of the king as David there at the end of the chapter. There's no mention that this is King David, father of Absalom, or Absalom, David's son. It's all just kind of a facade here. All right, Joab's got him. Absalom, you go in, you bow down. David, you kiss him, and we'll just shake hands and we'll go our separate ways and we'll pretend that everything's hunky-dory. And what we're going to find out very quickly as we get to 2 Samuel 15 is that everything is not hunky-dory. That Absalom still has rage within him, desire against his father, and he's going to work to overthrow the reign of David. So a very interesting chapter in the story of David here in 2 Samuel. Foolish wisdom. Foolish wisdom. Wisdom plays a predominant role throughout the chapter. Joab sent to Tekoa to find a wise woman. Joab thinks he's doing a wise thing and trying to get these two guys back together in the manner in which he is undertaking. The woman praises David because he has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God. But yet, much like Absalom, whatever wisdom David has, and certainly the lack of wisdom present in Absalom's life, none of it seems to be on display in the right ways. So what are some lessons that we can leave with tonight? Let me give you 3 of them very quickly. Number 1, this text reminds us that not all wisdom is wise. Not all wisdom is wise. If you want me to say it another way, not all wisdom is good wisdom. Or if you want it another way, not all wisdom is heavenly wisdom. James teaches us this in James chapter 3, where James tells us there's heavenly wisdom and there's earthly wisdom. And we've got to be aware and cognizant of which wisdom it is that we're following, which wisdom that we're living by. I think what Joab was doing here was born out of a good desire, but the method that he employed and the wisdom that was in operation here was not a heavenly wisdom. And I say that because the reconciliation that Joab was seeking and the story in which this wise woman from Tekoa told doesn't display the wisdom of God in how to deal with this matter. There's reconciliation that needs to come about, but that reconciliation, that restoration must come on the heels of justice being done. And justice has been left wide open in this story. There's no justice for Tamar and what she endured. There's no justice for Amnon and his life being taken in premeditated murder. Justice is just left completely undone, but yet Joab and this wise woman of Tekoa is simply saying, we got to get you guys back together. Yes, we need restoration, but restoration must come in the right way. It must come in the right way. And so the story reminds us that not all wisdom is wise wisdom. It's not all heavenly wisdom. It's not all good wisdom. We need to make sure that we're doing things God's way. You remember in David's story, we saw him many times. In the Psalms especially, but even in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, he's consulting the Lord. He's seeking the Lord. He's asking the Lord, give me wisdom, give me insight, give me direction. But in this particular instance, perhaps that's what he was going to do. Go to your house and I'll give some orders. Let me get some insight in this. But the story moved on and David got caught up in it and he just said, yeah, this is it. That's what we're going to do. And he brings Absalom back, not necessarily according to the wisdom of God, but according to the wisdom of the woman from Tekoa. He brought Absalom back without justice ever being applied. And we know that because when Absalom brings Joab to his house after he burned up his barley fields, he said, I need to get to the presence of the king, and if there's guilt in me, let him just go ahead and put me to death. Unmeted justice was hanging over the head of Absalom. He didn't know where he stood. So there was no hope of restoration and reconciliation in this relationship without what needed to be done taking place. There was a subversion. There was a going around, an avoidance of all the steps that needed to happen in the reconciliation between these two. And the wisdom that was employed wasn't the wisest of the ways. So not all wisdom is wise. Secondly, I think this story reminds us that we should not delay in doing what's right or what needs to be done. Again, much of where we're at in 2 Samuel 14 hangs upon David not taking any action. You probably don't remember, but maybe you do, but I think it was 2 Wednesday nights ago when we looked at 2 Samuel 13, as we looked at the men in that chapter and the role that they played in the story of Amnon and Tamar. David's role was one of inactivity, of passivity. He hears the story of what happened with Tamar and he basically does nothing. He weeps and he cries, which we would hope that we would all do, but he doesn't go to see Tamar. He doesn't deal with Amnon. He doesn't hear anything from Absalom. He's just inactive. And now this is stretched on for 5 years. For 5 years. There's been no talking to Absalom. No dealing with the issue. 2 years he's in Jerusalem now. And nothing. David doesn't even want to look at him. Don't want him in his presence. He's avoiding doing what needs to be done. Now, when I say we should not delay in doing what's right, I don't mean that we just rush into doing everything. Yes, we seek wisdom. Yes, we do it the right way. We don't want to be hasty. But what I think this story reminds us of is that we simply cannot sit and do nothing. We simply can't be inactive in situations that God has made plain and clear. Don't delay in doing what's right and needs to be done. And then lastly, it always amazes me, especially in these historical narratives and in these passages like this, how we see the gospel. And again, 2 Samuel 14 is a chapter that teaches us the gospel, and it teaches us that we can rejoice in the wisdom of God in the gospel of his Son, Jesus Christ. Paul would write in his letter to the Corinthians that the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. The world thinks the gospel is nothing but foolishness, but it's wiser than the foolishness of men. It's the wisdom of God on display. And so ultimately what Joab is wanting and what the woman from Tekoa is wanting is that there's to be reconciliation without justification taking place. Yes, he is a God who is a life giver, and he is a God who would not allow one who is an outcast to remain banished. He'll bring the prodigal home. But it doesn't mean that his justice is ignored. It doesn't mean that the issue isn't dealt with. We're all sinners. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. But thanks be unto God, he has made a way for us to be reconciled, for us to live in his house, to come before his face, to enjoy his presence. We're not like Absalom here in relation to King David. No, we're brought back. It's sweet and it's wonderful and it's glorious, but it happens only because God's justice has been met. This is what Romans is all about, isn't it? He is both just and the justifier. He has dealt with the issue at hand, our sin, not by ignoring it or sweeping it under the rug, but by placing that judgment upon his Son at the cross, so that we who are outcast can receive his mercy. The issue here with David and Absalom is that justice, that right judgment that needed to happen never took place. Therefore, restoration never occurred. But in the wisdom of God and the gospel of his Son, justice has been fully met at the cross. And because of that, we can be brought into a relationship with him. I think it's Psalm 84:10. Justice and mercy, righteousness and peace have kissed each other. They've met. They've met. They don't meet here in 2 Samuel 14. That's the whole crux of the matter. And that's why things are about to explode in 2 Samuel 15. They don't meet here, but they meet at the cross. And the wisdom of God's plan to redeem lost mankind. So 2 Samuel 14 and all of its puzzling intricacies and unusualness and its GQ depiction of Absalom and all that it gives us, ultimately at its heart, it causes us to remember the gospel and what God has done for us. That the justice that we deserve fell upon his Son, so God's mercy could be extended to us so that we who are outcasts don't have to remain that way. Thank God for the gospel. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word tonight. We thank you for the gospel of your Son. And Lord, we pray that our hearts would rejoice in it yet again. Father, would you be with us now as we go? Lord, lead us in paths of righteousness. God, help us to walk in ways of heavenly wisdom. God, let us not delay in doing what is right. Let us not be guilty of the sins of omission. Father, let us know what is good and let us hasten to do it, to obey your laws. And Father, we thank you. We thank you for the wisdom of the cross. We thank you for justice and mercy meeting there. And we thank you for being a life-giving God who brings the outcast to himself. Father, if it's your will that we gather this upcoming Lord's Day, Lord, let us come eager and longing. Lord, setting all other things aside and fixing our thoughts simply upon you. And let's rejoice in you, the God of our salvation. In Jesus' name, amen.